Hey everyone. I just got back from the gym, and also last night I got back from Danny Boyle and Alex Garland's sequel to the legendary zombie movie 28 Days Later, 28 Years Later, Part 1. We'll get into that in a bit. So before going too far into it, here's my initial thoughts. It's very good, a bit flawed in terms of story and pacing, and a very somewhat insulting, or rather, not insulting, unfulfilling ending. However, filled with some of the most creative direction and cinematography that I've ever seen, at least in terms of movie of this side, filled with heart, blood, gore, and beauty in a very bleak world. To the average moviegoer, it might be a 7. To someone like me who's a fan, I give it an 8. I wanted to like it more. I wanted to love it more. I do like it, and partially I do love it, but I just don't like it or love it as nearly as much. But that's my initial score of it. But how is the movie really? Without getting too much into spoilers, let's dive into it. So the movie takes place 28 years later after the initial outbreak of the rage virus, which thankfully has not spread to Europe and is basically only in the UK. Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England. And it follows Spike, a young boy in a small little village in a small isle in England. And through certain events with his father and mother, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson and Jodie Cormier, or Jodie Comer, however her name is pronounced, he learns about life, what it means to be a man, and growing up far, far faster than you need to. This movie, in terms of a technical perspective, with the exception of one shot with a bunch of CGI deer, is absolutely beautiful. This movie was, for the most part, shot on an iPhone. And there are times where it's very clear that it was shot on an iPhone, but in a good way. It adds to this movie's very raw flavor, The first one was shot on an HD, Sony home video camcorder, which led to this very grainy and unnatural look to it, which, has since kind of grown in popularity. 28 Days Later is praised for that look. And I know they wanted to kind of return to form and shoot this movie in that sort of same look. And what's the cheapest camera you can get? The one that's on your phone, basically for free. And it works. There are some truly aspired shots here, despite the fact it's 276 by 1. So it's like it's like this wide, but it's filled with absolutely phenomenal cinematography. Danny Boyle's unhinged direction works really well for this movie, as well as Alex Garland's, for the most part, brilliant writing. And, Aaron Taylor Johnson, Jodie Comer, Ray Fiennes, and even the kid, I think his name is Alfie, who plays Spike, all deliver absolutely phenomenal performances. This movie is one of the few legacy sequels that I can look at and say, yeah, this not only builds upon the spirit of the original, it actually has, it has the legs to stand amongst, 28 Days Later. It doesn't really acknowledge 28 weeks, and I'm sure 28 weeks later is going to be the redheaded stepchild of this, universe, but whatever. Where the movie, like I said, before I get into the couple of the big negatives here, I will say this as well. There is, unlike The Last of Us, which got a lot of complaints for its lack of violence and zombie action, there is a lot to be had here, and it is fucking wild. This movie has a couple moments where they do stuff where I can't help but yell, Jesus Christ. Pardon the name. I didn't mean to invoke it, but there are like scenes of violence where you just look and you're like, oh my God. And then there's moments of like sheer bleak beauty that just bring you tears and makes that little knot in your chest. Well, never outright crying, but you feel something in here. I won't get into the specifics. This is a movie that you have to see. However, there was a critique, I think, by Jeremy Jans that when I saw the movie, I totally get. Because it's true. This movie does feel like Alex Garland came to Danny Boyle and said, hey, I have two ideas. Which one you want to do? And Danny Boyle said, let's do both. Now, usually when you get something like that, you think they'd weave like the narrative threads together so that way it's more of a cohesive story. That is not the case here. Instead, it's literally here's one movie, here's the transition, here's the other movie. You know, it's like the moment one story ends, the next one begins. And because of that weird transition, it leads to a very uneven movie because you have two movies. You have a movie about a father and a son going on essentially a rite of passage, a hunting trip. And then you have a movie about a boy trying to take his mother, who has an ailment, to a sort of unseen doctor who may or may not exist in hopes to cure her of her ailment. And it's literally that one for about 45 minutes. Then there's about a 5-minute transition, and then it goes to the other one. And because of that, there are certain characters who appear in the first half that are essentially gone from the second. And it leads to a kind of jarring experience because essentially you spend so much time with certain characters and then nothing. And you know, and then on top of that, there's a couple moments where characters do things and you wonder, why are you doing this? You know, like you know you're about to die, and then they die, and you're like, oh, well, see, they're an idiot. Why the fuck would they do this? This is ridiculous. And there's also a couple things that happen here. Like, here's the thing: this is a completely unhinged movie. Now we're not getting to the negatives. Now we're getting into this is may or break the movie for you. There are choices that are made here in terms of creativity. Now, you have to be on board. You have to be on, from the moment the zombies show up and you see what they look, by the way, all the zombies here look the same. And for those of you that have seen the movie, you understand what I mean. A lot of these zombies look a certain way. And there's a reason for why they look like that. They've been out into the world for so long. Of course, they're going to look a certain way. There are a couple shots, and I'm not talking about the amazing like action scene where it does like the whole quick Matrix like bullet time thing, because they had a rig where they put like 16 iPhones on a rig and they shot it all at once so that way they can, that's cool, they do that. But there are some obscenities, let's say, of zombies that are in full view and frame, and some of these obscenities are a bit long and quite large and very noticeable. And it is, sorry, the lighting. And it is, it gets to the point where there are certain shots, and look, I am an immature man, but there are, like I said, obscenities that are like, you have shots of characters and then you have a shot of a zombie just standing there. And it's just like, some of these obscenities are just in clear and present view. So you're just kind of like, oh, right, the characters are talking. You know, it's somewhat distracting. It makes sense for this world. It really does, but it is distracting at times. And like I said, this movie has a very Danny Boyle stylistic flair. If you are not familiar with his work, like he gets a little stylistically in terms of how he likes to present things. Sometimes they're very abstract, sometimes they're very, very on the nose. But overall, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and as obscene as some of these zombies looked, I couldn't help but be like, damn, that's cool. Even though they do a thing with a zombie in this movie that is just straight up like, here's the thing, without giving spoilers away, they do a concept that has already been done. However, they flip it on its head for this version of said concept. And I'm interested to see where they take this plot thread, because now we get into the final real negative of the movie, and that is its ending. It is not fulfilling, and it leaves the door wide open, because this is basically a part 1 of 3, or part 1 of 2, depending on how this movie plays out. But either way, it's left wide open, very much sequel baiting, because they there is a character that comes into the very end. It's not Cillian Murphy. It's someone else. However, this is still a rather big name star who just comes in and has about a minute of screen time before the movie ends. And it is absolutely insane what they do with this guy. And you're like, okay, cool. Kind of weird to circle back here, but that's fine. And then the movie ends. Just ends. Here's the thing. The movie is very enjoyable, but it's not fully satisfying or fulfilling because it's only part of a story told. The whole thing's not fully done yet. But I will say this. This is, objectively speaking, already one of the best zombie films ever made. Just from a technical perspective, a story perspective, like just all around, this is a very human story set in a very rustic and vibrant and even still bleak world. It works on a lot of levels in terms of its presentation, but unfortunately in terms of its pacing and in terms of its structure and even in terms of its ending, there are a lot of flaws that are there. You know, the fact is that as much as the second half of the movie has so much heart behind it, it is still essentially just the second part of a movie. Or even then, just the second story told. It's two stories, and they just kind of are. It's like they wanted to go with the anthology idea, but they just decided to staple the two ideas together. It leads to very distinct parts of the movie that you're either going to love or you're going to hate. And like I said, the obscenities of the zombies. If you're not on board with obscenities, you're not going to enjoy this movie. But if you're willing to look past the obscenities, if you're willing to look past some of the story flaws and even the slightly insulting ending, and like I said, it's only insulting if it's never concluded. We'll have to see what happens next. But if you're willing to look past all this, you get a surreal and vibrant story about growing up and becoming a man, set on the backdrop of a zombie apocalypse. And it kind of does, in some ways, it does The Last of Us better than The Last of Us. Which is ironic because Alex Garland, the writer of this movie, said that The Last of Us was a huge inspiration behind him writing parts of this movie. So those are my thoughts on 28 Years Later. I'm sorry I couldn't get further into certain plot points or even certain characters or even certain actors, because to go into them would be to spoil this movie. And I don't think I should do that. Not with this one. This is something you have to see. Sorry. Once again, lighting. This is something you have to see. You have to see it to believe it. You have to see it blindly. You have to see it blinded. I think that's how it's said. But either way, go. Enjoy it. Those are my thoughts. Go see it.